Panel this afternoon. I'll just briefly say my name is Michael. I'm a current scholar. I'm a member of the organizing committee for the forum this weekend, and I'm very pleased to introduce this final panel of the inaugural Rhodes Forum on the Humanities. The final panel is titled The Future of Humanities Education, and it is moderated by Professor Karen O'Brien, the head of Humanities Division here at Oxford, and will feature Dr. Rebecca Boggs, the Senior Program Officer, Division of Education Programs at the National Endowment for the Humanities, Professor Evelyn O'Callaghan, Professor of West Indian Literature at the University of the West Indies, and Dr. Maria Sachiko Cecire, who is the Associate Professor of Literature and the Director of the Center for Experimental Humanities at Bard College. So please join me in warmly welcoming them.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I hope the mic is working. This is our final session. We will try and keep it more or less to time, but we are running a little bit late. And I am delighted that at the end of this wonderful 2 days, we've come on to the topic that is really about how we make humanities a massive opportunity for the next generation. Many of us are educators, and still more of us value the education that humanities gives us in the many roles in life that we and our students take. So I think it's really important that we end this 2 days with some reflections on the future of humanities education. Changing in so many ways and so rapidly across the world, so difficult to change in some institutions, as I know only too well. We're going to reverse slightly the order of speakers, so we're going to start with Rebecca Boggs, and we're so delighted to have someone from the National Endowment for the Humanities here, and then Evelyn, and then finally Maria, so just slightly different order from your program. And everybody's going to speak for about 5 minutes, and we'll try and allow plenty of time for questions at the end. So Rebecca, away you go.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear the great diversity of voices that we've heard throughout these 2 days. And so I think, in some sense, what I'll try to do is echo back some parts of that, and to also bring together, or in a smattering of the poetic and the practical, the semantic and the structural, just briefly, and then see where people want to take it. So I've been thinking about how to live, what to do, which is the title of a poem by American poet and insurance executive Wallace Stevens. We can take it as questions or as a set of instructions. It's in part what we look to the humanities for, but also what we ask ourselves about how to go forward with in our love of the humanities. And I think part of the message of these 2 days that I would also want to emphasize for the future of humanities education, and I think what's important in the kind of humanities funding that I've been involved with, is a sense of getting out of the framework of scarcity, not the sense of either or, but both and. One thing that people sometimes take from improv theater is the idea of saying yes and, not yes but, when taking things in a different direction or building on what comes before. So I'd like to start with 2 touchstones. One comes from the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who, although I was at Trinity, acknowledged that he was a Balliol man. He was also a Jesuit priest, and he spent the last years of his life teaching ancient Greek to Irish schoolboys. So he's known to us as a poet, but he was devoted to educating the young. And he wrote, "Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came." This is someone who is passionately attached to the idea of individuals and also things in nature being able to deal out their essence, their inscape. And I think, to me, it can speak to all of us also as that sense of speaking for and about what we have passion for in the humanities. Also, in a practical sense, I feel I need to say here something about what I do in the very mundane sense at the NEH, which is why I came, not in the metaphysical sense that Hopkins meant it, but what I might have to contribute, although I must give the disclaimer, any opinions I represent are my own and not those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I hope any factual information I'm able to present about the NEH and its good work will redound to its credit. The other touchstone that I think about is Wallace Stevens's, from his Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, which is divided in 3 parts, one of which is It Must Change, although I'm actually drawing from a section called It Must Give Pleasure. And hearkening back to the observation that was made from the floor yesterday about crisis as a point of decision or of choice, Stevens writes, and his imagined character is male, but I think we can change the pronouns however we would like. He had to choose, but it was not a choice between excluding things. It was not a choice between, but of. He chose to include the things that in each other are included, the whole, the complicate, the amassing harmony. And so having a sense of the ways in which the variety of things that we do can overlap with each other, can be part of a harmony, cannot be competing with each other for space and resources. So with those in mind, I'll say a little bit about what I do and what the NEH does. As a federal agency of the American government, part of the executive branch, founded in 1965 with our sister agency, the National Endowment for the Arts. So we've recently celebrated our 50th anniversary. And a few words from its founding legislation, where if you think of in the context of 1965 and the space race and the Cold War, making space to support the arts and humanities on the grounds that an advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must give full value and support to the other great branches of scholarly and cultural activity in order to achieve a better understanding of the past, a better analysis of the present, and a better view of the future, since we're tasked with talking about the future in this panel. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. Americans should receive in school background and preparation in the arts and humanities to enable them to recognize and appreciate the aesthetic dimensions of our lives, the diversity of excellence that comprises our cultural heritage, and artistic and scholarly expression. So I think one of the things we can do in looking to the future is sometimes going back to the past and taking out some of these words and saying, this is where we are coming from, this is what people said was important. We can also craft our own words, but drawing on that trajectory of this doesn't come out of nowhere, and this is part of a shared, diverse, multivalent heritage that we are constantly returning to, preserving in the language that Karen brought forward about what the humanities are and do, and exploring and reinventing. I'm a program officer in the Division of Education Programs, so I work with grants we make for professional development for K through 12 teachers and higher education faculty, and with different kinds of curriculum development grants in the humanities. At the NEH, we deal with things sort of by audience. So my division works with things that impact primarily the classroom. They might extend to the co-curricular, but the Division of Research Programs is dealing with research that might go into publication, or public programs, digital humanities, preservation and access, partnership with the State Humanities Council. So we have those different areas, happy to talk about them, but just that sense of the panoply of the ways one can take these things forward. And in that sense of both and, I feel that we do a good job at the NEH of, and I want to see us continue to be in dialogue with others to say, we want to go deep in different disciplines and existing areas of the humanities in all of the places that people are passionate about, and also explore different connections and interstices. So one of the things we do is fund summer programs. And this summer, for example, I had the pleasure to go to a one-week program for K through 12 teachers, primarily more at the middle and upper level, on Frederick Douglass and literary crossroads, looking at the idea of narrative, looking at autobiography, and specifically African-American autobiography, thinking about how the relationship might be between teaching this text and other African-American writings in fiction, in poetry, connecting to Douglass in historical context, political philosophy, rhetoric. Other summer programs look at intersections between the humanities and the sciences. There was one on flu, the 1918 pandemic, looking at the history of medicine. There are environmental humanities. And I think we need to be ready to make the case for the things we are passionate about and unapologetic about them. There's not a sense that we have to be arguing for the use value, but in some cases it is useful to be able to talk back to the narratives that may be imposed, that may be false narratives. At the NEH, as a branch of the federal government, we do not do any lobbying for our funding or for other aspects. We can just present information about the work that we do. There is a group called the National Humanities Alliance that does some more advocating on behalf of the humanities. And they have a very interesting website at studythehumanities.org that goes some way to disabusing some of these notions, or saying, oh, here's the evidence that actually humanities majors don't make less money than others. That might be true the first year right out of your degree, but if you look at the larger swath, it's not true at all. Or here's video of business leaders or science leaders talking about how background in the humanities got them to where they are or is necessary to what they're doing. People in the humanities talking about what they do as an anthropologist. So bringing these other pieces to the fore. And so I'd like to just say a little bit about one program that I've been involved with that was a new program we created in my division, which works at the intersections between humanities and non-humanities areas. And what did this come out of? Not a sense that this was more valuable or supplanted the other kinds of humanities work that we did, but when we wanted to create a new grant field at the undergraduate level, we had conversations with at least 50 different educators, administrators, a couple of other funders who work in the undergraduate education at community colleges, four-year colleges, two-year colleges, public, private, large, small, across the country to say, what are the challenges that you are facing and how could we help? What are the things that you need help doing? And one of the things that people spoke to was this sense that they were stuck in their silos and you were only rewarded for doing certain things within your discipline. And everyone talked a good game of saying that you should collaborate with others and do interdisciplinary work, but there was no actual support for that and no time to develop those kinds of programs. And also the idea that experiential learning and hands-on learning was important, but again, there was no space for developing that. So we created a grant program in 2016 called Humanities Connections that calls upon people to create plans for working together, humanities and non-humanities faculty that might be in quantitative social sciences or in STEM or in pre-professional tracks like nursing and criminal justice, and working together to create new integrative curriculum for their students with an experiential learning component. And as we were working on this, at the same time, the National Academy of Sciences was convening a study committee on integrative learning. And it was supported in part by the NEH and by the NEA. And the report they came out with in spring 2018 was called Branches from the Same Tree. And they were drawing on a quotation from Einstein, who had written in 1937, "All religions, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree. All these aspirations are directed toward ennobling man's life, lifting it from the sphere of mere physical existence and leading the individual toward freedom." So I think that sense of, different branches can do different things. They have different configurations. They bear different fruit, but they're connected. And I think it also can take us in that sense of the branches and the fruit and the leaves and the continuing growth are connected to where they started, but different from. And that applies, I think, within and outside of the humanities and our connections. One of the people on the study committee who spoke to our Humanities Connections directors was Bonnie Thornton, who is Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at University of Maryland. She's the first woman and first African American to hold that position. And she said, speaking from her background as someone who had helped head up one of the earliest programs in women and gender studies, she was trained as a sociologist and realizing that now, if she was training students in women and gender studies, they were going to do slightly different things from what she had been trained up to do. So the future of humanities education is in part trying to carry the legacy of the past, but also prepare others to do things that we haven't done or don't know how to do, and to make those connections, bring our whole selves, encourage others to bring our whole selves, listen to each other, figure out how to build things with each other. And so I would just want to leave us with a set of words from one of my other communities of text and practice. In the Jewish community, when you read from the Torah scroll and you get to the end of one of the 5 books, the whole congregation stands up and says, "Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek," which I might translate as, be strong, and let us strengthen one another. So I'll encourage all of us to be strong in the things that we're passionate about, the things for which we say, what I do is me, for that I came, and then let us strengthen each other in what we can build. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. And now Evelyn. Do I just go ahead?
Yes, please do. I want to start by saying a big thank you to the warden and the team at Rhodes House for inviting me to this Really timely and fascinating forum. It's been enlightening. I've learned a huge amount. And one of the nicest things about it, I have to say, is the amount of young scholars that I've been talking to, who are, most of them, not even in the humanities and have stayed throughout, listening avidly, discussing. It's very, very comforting, I think, to my generation to have, so many people, even if they're not interested in the humanities. So big up to One, Levi, Ramina, Ngoni, Amina, James, and Kimberly. Right. As for me, I left Wolfson College and Oxford in 1981 to take up a post as temporary lecturer in English at the Jamaican campus of the University of the West Indies. For political reasons, the campus was broke and the country was in the grip of the IMF. Money was tight, and after paying rent and furniture hire, I had a minus salary for the first month. But I was a Rhodes Scholar, I was giving back, and there was enough 1970s ideology still around to keep all of us enthusiastic and committed to opening minds and exposing young Caribbean people to their own literature, their own culture, their own linguistic theory. Now I'm approaching retirement at the Barbadian campus of the UWI. I'm in what was then the Department of English, afterwards the Department of Literatures in English, and latterly I've completed a term as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education. For political reasons, the campus is broke and the country is in the grip of the IMF. I am not exaggerating. I started and end my UWI career in the grip of the IMF. But the big difference is that the academics in the humanities are no longer enthusiastic, no longer inspired about their disciplines. If anything, there's been a huge drop in morale, as we see our research areas sidelined in secondary as well as tertiary education in favor of STEM subjects. Education, and tertiary education in particular, is no longer considered a right so much as a privilege, and an expensive one at that. And the only value of that education, it seems to many, is to qualify students for a job. So therefore, parents, partners, school leavers, and lending organizations are more willing to help pay for training in law or medicine or business in the belief that these degrees automatically qualify graduates for a profession. There's a lot less confidence that a BA or a B.Ed degree will do so. And this is true, I think, across the developing world, or I'm beginning to think everywhere. An article I encountered recently posits that the humanities, quote, should be re-imaged in terms of interdisciplinarity and as collaborative digital humanities in Africa, and thereby I'm thinking in the developing world, where student numbers and financial viability often trump the intellectualization of disciplines. The humanities, more often than not, finds itself victim to higher education cutbacks. In addition, major shifts in society brought about by the recent technology and globalization-driven communications revolution pose serious questions about the continued viability of sole reliance on traditional communication approaches that have preoccupied humanities scholars over the years. We were so concerned about this that we held a cross-university, cross-campus meeting on the subject of transforming the humanities. And at that workshop, the PVC, Board for Undergraduate Studies, set the context, citing some of the reasons for the huge decline of students in history, his discipline. A survey of secondary school students in Barbados were asked what negative factors outside the classroom affected their view of history, and the responses are enlightening. The way people react to my doing that subject, it seems like a waste of time. Quote, people do not encourage or support me in the subject as they would with science subjects. And best of all, some people say that history happened ages ago, so it doesn't matter. So what do? We try for more collaborative, interdisciplinary degree programs that utilize technology. So I'm in between the and the technology. We re-educate our market about the actual job record of humanities and education graduates, which is not bad at all. We lobby the governments that pay tuition costs and persuade them, sorry, Freudian slip, and persuade them of the value of our disciplines. We harness alumni to speak to schools about how their own degrees prepared them for the job market. And also, technology companies have recognized the need to diversify their hiring practices to include more people from backgrounds in philosophy and psychology if they want to tackle the problem of misinformation online. This is a warning by the head of one of the biggest internet charities. Mitchell Baker, head of the Mozilla Foundation, observes that if we have STEM education without the humanities, or without ethics, or without understanding human behavior, then we are intentionally building the next generation of technologists who have not even the framework or the education or vocabulary to think about the relationship of STEM to society or humans or life. Because that is what the humanities teach us, what it means to be human, how we think, what we believe and why, how our culture has developed in a particular way, what's gone into our history, and how the people who write it have shaped and reshaped it, how we imagine and make art from that imagination, how we communicate, how we learn languages, how languages work, and how our brains process their signals, how we appreciate creativity in music, in dance, in visual and performance, art, and why, what values we hold and how we acquired them, how we dream, and as the Guyanese poet Martin Carter put it, dream to change the world. Thanks. 5 minutes.
Thank you. And now Maria.
Thank you, Evelyn. Also, you kind of teed this up very nicely for me, so I don't have to go through some of the more difficult realities that many of us are facing, and can kind of segue directly into some of the hopeful directions that I think that many of us can be starting to take in our work. So, you know, in addition to the kinds of concerns about the culture of optimization, cults of data and testing, suspicion of humanities knowledge, you know, public trivializations of humanities and public discourse, the kinds of things that Evelyn was just mentioning. You know, we also have a lot to do to think about, as some of the panelists here have been discussing, the need to decenter colonialist and Eurocentric notions of intellectual history in the classes that we do teach. Some cultures, some organizations of universities have already begun to tackle this better than others, but there's so much to be done, as we know. And that is a kind of position from which my colleagues and I started to think about what might be possible just on the ground in the small place where we worked at a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. You know, in spite of all of the difficulties that many of us are seeing in higher education and indeed all humanities education right now, certainly things are not all bad. You know, students, I think our students lead the way. They tell us what needs to be done, and listening to them is one of the most important things that we can do. Right now, I'm actually working on a study with a colleague based on a program, the NEH-funded program that I worked on for some time, working with underserved youth in settings all across the United States on a book club. And these were young people coming from juvenile justice settings, group homes, alternative schools. And one of the elements of the study that I found most enlightening and important was that over 75% of them say that they think regularly about what we would consider big humanities questions, like how do technologies shape individuals and influence whole societies, those kinds of questions. And over 40% of them said they think about them frequently or all the time. So we often have profound misunderstandings of who is interested in the humanities. Frankly, I don't think any of the things that we talk about or work on are meant just for a small group of us. These are human questions that everyone is already thinking about and care about. One of the areas of my own research, thinking about fan communities, is kind of effusion of writing. People are writing all kinds of art and creating all kinds of new stories. But sometimes higher education, we don't necessarily always recognize or create space for that. So with all of this in mind, these are some of the things that I'm thinking about the future of humanities education, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've been doing at Bard as well. First, I think it's incredibly important that we be working to redefine what the humanities mean in the public imagination. For a long time, the term humanities has really been associated with a very particular set of narratives from a very particular set of people and a very particular set of texts. In truth, the humanities is and should be the study of human cultures, experiences, and creations from an array of perspectives and a diverse array of forms. It doesn't even have to be necessarily just writing or painting. There are so much cultural material out there that we are not thinking about in the ways that perhaps we should, and centering in the work that we do. With that in mind, also, I think we need to be carving out spaces to experiment in the humanities. That means our teaching, our research, our work with communities. These are opportunities to be not just repeating what we've been doing in the past, but building on the knowledge of our senior colleagues and those who've come before us to build and establish other kinds of tools, methods, approaches, and technologies, and build teams from different kinds of backgrounds. So these are the kinds of things that we've been thinking about, this redefining the humanities, carving out spaces for experimentation in the Center and Curriculum for Experimental Humanities that I founded and direct at Bard. It has been pushing since its inception at traditional boundaries around the methods, texts, and cultural norms that have long dominated the academic humanities, and been trying to think about, if we were to do experiments in the humanities, what might that mean? So people see me and they think that I'm the digital humanities person, and the truth is that we are a small liberal arts college, so we certainly include the digital humanities in the work that we do when we can, but limiting ourselves to big computational text analysis would not be practical and also, frankly, not make sense for most of my colleagues or my students. Instead, we're more interested in the fundamental questions around what does it mean to do the humanities? What are the tools that we're supposed to use? How do material conditions shape the way that we do the humanities, and how might they shape them in the future? And that sometimes means taking advantage of new technologies, and sometimes it means recognizing that there are profound limitations on new technologies, some kinds of materials that should not be archived, that should not be shared, that belong to some people who don't want them to be open access to everybody. So these are some of the kinds of things we're thinking about. And I found that, first of all, Bard is if any of you know Bard, it's a wonderful place. It's very much grounded in love and study of the arts and humanities, has a strong social justice mission, and a very outsized footprint for such a small place. And when I talked to my colleagues in the digital humanities about why we're called experimental humanities, they're all amazed that we were allowed to be called experimental humanities. And I said, oh, no. At Bard, it's way easier to get through a program called experimental humanities than digital humanities. Because my colleagues like, does this mean you're going to wrap yourself in tissue paper? Good. And we have had speakers who do that. So some of the things that we've been thinking about have been how to develop more inclusive and innovative pedagogy, digital and face-to-face public projects, often working within our community, and building interdisciplinary research. And all of these things, for me, they've been opportunities to work in ways that have, again, pushed the boundaries of what we do in our classrooms and our research and that kind of thing. But really, the bigger issue for me is imagining alternative futures. I think that so much of the discourse around the humanities has been a defensive one about how do we prepare ourselves for a future that is inevitably coming, where it's going to be increasingly casualized labor, increasingly attack of the robots who are going to take over our students' jobs, these kinds of things, and suggest that these are the only possible futures that lie ahead of us. And I think that if we are not in a position to articulate other kinds of futures and train our students to have opportunities to work with each other across wide different disciplinary backgrounds to start to imagine what those futures might look like, then we are dooming ourselves in really terrifying ways. So a couple of practical things that we've been doing. We have, for instance, a digital history lab that works with community members. Often community members come to us with ideas about what they want to do. And that is really rethinking the notion of history. That's not just people who do deep research and then share it out with each other, and sometimes filters to the public, though we do some of that as well. But often community members saying, I have a story that I want to tell. In our case, we have a digital history van that goes out and records oral histories and enters them into the public record, works with local historical societies to digitize objects and create public-facing websites that the public can use about our local history, and other kinds of projects like that. We have a really interdisciplinary food cluster that's just started, where we have microbiologists and indigenous studies experts and historians and all kinds of people working together to think about how do we create healthier, sustainable, and more just food systems. How do we take from kinds of knowledge that have been around for a very long time and combine them with cutting-edge technologies in the life sciences to think about how some of traditional practices might actually be healthier and safer ways of developing food safety than maybe some of the big industrialized and unsustainable systems that we have now. And in teaching, our students are doing an array of work. And one of the things we think about is how do we help them not just recognize the kinds of inequality that are out there, but teach them some skills to think about how they can, in the present, combat some of those inequalities. So this semester, we have 2 courses colleagues of mine are running where we've integrated, the center has helped them to integrate Wikipedia editing modules, where they're trained in how to edit Wikipedia, learn about the vast inequality in who's actually writing and editing Wikipedia entries, which is where many, many, many people get their information from. And the courses, one of the courses is the students have been researching and citing, and then now have gone in and added new pages or updated pages on the Black Arts Movement. And the other course is a Native American history course, and they have gone into the 5 pages in our local area and revised them to accurately reflect the indigenous history of our area. So these are kinds of little things that can be done and also lead into much bigger projects. So those are just a few things to get us started to think about some of the ways in which we might imagine redefining the humanities, carving out spaces for experimentation, and really bending our mind towards imagining alternative futures.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marie. You've given us a really exciting set of vistas about what possibilities might be in terms of the future of humanities education, but we've also heard, of course, about the infrastructure and resource constraints of which we're very acutely aware. I think someone said yesterday that humanities are quite cheap. That is true, but they're not cost-free. And I wanted to ask the panel just to come right down to brass tacks a little bit on questions of infrastructure and what kind of structural and institutional conditions and interventions make it possible, from your experience in program, as a program leader, but also from our institutional experience as educators, what makes it possible to innovate and position humanities in that future-facing way, other than huge amounts of money, which we know we're not going to have? But what have you seen that is effective, and what could we learn in terms of our global institutional dialogue about how to continue to keep on that interface of the innovative and the fresh and the forward-facing? I'll start with you, Rebecca, because this is your lived reality.
It is. I think, a couple of things that I might take from that are, as you said, the humanities are cheap because we're not running cyclotrons, but I think it actually means a lot to people to give them due recognition for their work. And that may be, it may seem, compared to other things, a small amount of money. So for example, the relatively small, but you can live on it, stipend that school teachers or faculty receive to come to one of our tuition-free summer programs, to do that instead of having to teach an extra class or do something else. And many of them say this was the best academic experience either of my life or since grad school, or that they feel validated in a way that they are not in their home institutions, because someone is giving them time and money and space, even just a little bit of it. It's a room of one's own. The moment to focus on the things that are important to you and not be made secondary to someone else, either in their discipline, or your discipline isn't as good as my discipline, or the administration wants X, Y, and Z and jumping through hoops. To be treated as a humanities professional with dignity and respect. And I think that extends to the other kinds of grant making we make, in the sense of, someone had said when we were creating Humanities Connections, I don't think you need to make a grant that could be up to 3 years and $100,000. You just need to give people a little bit of money to talk to each other. And in some places that works, and in other places you need a bit more of a lever. And so saying to people, if you're going to create a new course, I'm not going to expect you to do that in your copious free time, which you don't have. You're going to pay people, I'm going to give you the money for a course release so that you don't teach one of your 4 courses, and you have time to create a new one. You have time to talk to your colleagues. You have time to make the assignments. You have a chance to teach the course, pilot it, try it out, talk about what worked and what didn't, come back again. So giving people the structures that work for that, and I think that's going to be different in each place. I want to be mindful of the fact that in the American context, some of what people are coming to us for is revamping things like gen ed and core courses. We have, in a sense, often a pool of humanities students who may not be humanities specialists, that may not exist in other places, where having to take some humanities is not part of their pool. But I think it does point to some of those possibilities where one of the things people might be doing in gen ed, or for the people who aren't already specialists, is saying, here's how various kinds of humanities pieces relate to what you've already decided is your non-humanities area or discipline. And these things come together to build a bigger picture of the world, the ways we can answer problems. And those are spaces where the humanities can partner with other specialized areas, even when people are going directly already into business, law, health professions, et cetera. But I think in part, asking colleagues and finding out from people what is it you need to build the things you want and to feel respected and valued.
Thank you. Evelyn.
What infrastructural changes would make it easier to offer the kind of forward-thinking or future-driven developments in the humanities? Get rid of quality control. It's the slowest, most tedious set of committees that we have to put every single course outline through. And it just slows the whole process down, so that by the time, if it ever comes through, you have permission to teach something that's no longer even that relevant. All right, I'm being very, very negative. I think your point is much more to, your last point was much more to the subject. I think that we need to see what it is our publics, in my case anyway, what does the public need and how can we give it to them? With collaboration with other disciplines or collaboration with other faculties, we certainly have the creativity to do it. We have the analytical powers to be able to argue for it. All we need to do is come together, I think, and really see, if people are honest, what it is that they need. Right now we have a terrible literacy problem in the Caribbean, largely to do with the fact that it's a very complex linguistic situation whereby the official first language is English, but very few people can speak English properly because of the interference of the Creole language, which is what most native speakers use. And so this idea that students can actually write an essay in standard English is an assumption that is very much based on nothing, because they can't. So we need to work out how businessmen and people who are writing reports in the corporate sector can get access to some really close not literacy, more like report writing skills, etc. And to learn the habit of reading more often, even on a little bit by bit basis, a short story a week or something like that. So there are needs out there.
I would say a couple things. Maybe the first one might seem a little surprising, and I've really learned this from my role as a leader in my institution and then working with other institutions, how incredibly important community building is. We get into this business because we love it and we love hanging out with other dorks who love it. And if our work is so grinding and so depressing and so backstabbing that you don't even want to turn up to it, why would you have chosen this? Most people who are in the humanities are wicked smart. They could be doing something else and making a lot of money. So one of our great tasks as leaders is often really prioritizing how do we build communities where people support each other, are enthusiastic about each other's work, learning from each other, feeling enlivened all the time. And sometimes that means like putting money aside for get-togethers of various kinds that are really about building community. And so much of EH has been often building a kind of alternative department, really, for all of my colleagues in different disciplines to come and meet with people they trust and toss around ideas that they know aren't going to leave the room. So that's really a big part of it, and as a free thing you can do, I suppose. Another is not free, but also really related to what Rebecca was saying, was about modeling livable lives. If we in the academic humanities cannot be people who have limitations around when we are expected to work and to what extremes we're expected to work. I do not know who is going to be doing it. We should be the ones, and particularly those of us who are lucky enough to be in tenured or senior positions, to say, you know, there are boundaries around how much and how long I'm going to work. I'm not going to be emailing my junior colleagues on weekends and asking them to do things, right? We should be people that are demonstrating that there is a way to live a life that is considered, full of pleasure, full of beauty, also full of activism, full of work, full of energy. But I do think that's a really important part of it. And that takes a lot of self-discipline, you know, and saying, no, don't do it. Don't perfect that thing. Go and like weed the garden with your kid or whatever it is. And I do think that's actually really important in building kind of departments and organizations that value that kind of time and space to think, reflect, and be, I think is incredibly important. But then I do think also, you know, there are political elements, you know, and UK universities are about to go on strike for casualization in pay as well as pensions. And sometimes that's what it takes. So I do think that all of these are part of kind of building infrastructures and spaces where great work can be done.
Thank you. I have some sympathy with what Evelyn says about quality control. I chaired a review of Hong Kong University's arts faculty recently, and talk about colonial legacies. The quality control system in the Hong Kong system was so cumbersome and so onerous. I thought this is not something to be proud of as a colonial legacy. I did want to ask just one more question before we throw the floor open, just for a very brief answer. Rebecca, you were talking a bit about interdisciplinary interfaces, and I was thinking in a previous role I had a role for education across all disciplines in a major university, and that's absolutely fascinating actually to talk to people in other educational settings about how they educate. And for me particularly it was the clinical settings, the nurses, the mental health nurses, working with them, talking to those students miles away from anything I had ever encountered, but their hunger for a humanities approach for some of the really difficult things that they were having to face, telling people about the death of a relative, delivering babies, dealing with frontline mental health issues at a very young age, was quite remarkable. And we started to build in some humanities-based classes into the clinical education in the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing. So I just wanted to ask you very briefly, where do you think, in your experience, a humanities education makes an impact in conjunction with another kind of education? What could we be doing? And this is, I mean, it's different in the British system, I know, than in other more comprehensive systems, but what could we be doing on those educational interfaces to share what we think is valuable about humanities with students who will do other things as their main discipline?
I think almost in its way is where can it not be relevant? But I mean, I think some of the things that are the most common areas of overlap, I think are places that some people are making into permanent programs. But things like medical humanities, health humanities, narrative medicine, all of the sort of, you know, bioethics, business ethics, anybody who's doing anything where they think the technical skill is the primary thing also need to think about the ethical and cultural embeddedness. So culturally competent or culturally sensitive engineering, physics, et cetera. You know, if you're going to go do work in the world, you need to know and be aware of what are the needs of the community that you're in, not just in the technical sense, but in the social, cultural, environmental sense. People who are doing entrepreneurship and wanting to think about creativity in the arts and humanities alongside innovation in the business sense. So I think that those are some of the places that it comes out most strongly, and the places that are forward thinking in their professional education of nurses, doctors, you know, entrepreneurs, are building those into criminal justice. That's another big one in the US context. Are building those into their programs as part of the infrastructure.
Thank you. Evelyn?
Talking of cheap, I think that creative writing is something that our students would love to do across all faculties. I know that because we've had people from law doing it. But the trouble is that we would have to rely on the agreement of our colleagues in the law faculty, because the tendency is just to cram the students full of law courses so that there's no time on their schedule for anything else. But they really love doing it. And it is It is something that not everybody has a talent for, but everyone seems to think they do. So there's always some benefit to be gained from looking at your creative writing with an educated eye among your peers and with a teacher. And I think that would really transform a lot of the doctors, the lawyers, the managers, the scientists. I think doing that would really help, allowing them a creative side, which we have.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. I mean, one thing that strikes me is the role that administrators and heads of schools might do in really prioritizing how these kinds of humanities elements might be not just integrated into a separate course like the ethics and CS course, but rather fundamentally built into the courses themselves. So I have a colleague at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute just up the road from us who just got an NEH grant actually to expand a program he started where they're integrating ethical, or like the questions of ethics and really the history of how computer science has been born into an intro CS class. And the idea there is that they are actually studying some of the race and gendered histories of computer science, which if you don't know are like incredibly rich and interesting, certainly not the image of a computer scientist as you imagine today, into the core class while they're doing the programming itself in an effort to increase retention of women and people of color. And I know in his first round, they already by far over-enrolled in those areas of kind of student demographics than the others. And we've been working with them and talking with them about some of the work that they do. One of my colleagues, who's, spoiler, my partner at Bard, he teaches statistics, and while he's teaching how to do statistics, is also talking about the eugenic history of statistics, its relationship to evolutionary biology, the kind of prevalence of eugenics in the way that statistics developed. So it's not just here are the numbers, how you crunch them out and do them. These kinds of humanistic forms of knowledge are everywhere. And when I was asked to speak with my colleagues about how to create more inclusive classrooms, as all colleges are trying to do, one thing I challenge them to do, and I challenge myself to do, and maybe challenge you to do, is to ask, am I aware of the ways in which my field specifically, but then also higher education more broadly, has contributed to oppression in the world? And how can I demonstrate in my course how I'm trying to first show I'm aware of it, and second, be part of pushing back against it? And for someone in math, they can say, well, how am I supposed to do that? But thinking through these kinds of questions of history and use, those can be just kind of tossed into the conversation, built into what you're doing in ways that really kind of set off lights for a lot of students, I think.
Just add one thing, Karen, because it's interesting that at this forum, a friend of Elika's was in attendance, and he's a medical doctor. And we had a great chat yesterday when you were doing the mentoring session. And he said that he has learned so much from being here and feels that there is now part of him that is not developed. And he wants to see how he can do so that he can come up with a self-narrative, which I thought was lovely, Anyway, so yes. Again, well done.
Yes. Okay, let's throw open the floor for a few questions. Levi at the front.
Hi, I'll stand just because I'm really short. So my question, I think, comes from a more personal place, and also I think a lot of us students who are here, who are in the humanities, who have had the fortune to come here but are poised on the question of what to do next. And so the future of the humanities for me relates to what I want to do in my future, and also as someone who plans on being a writer and an educator, what that's going to look like for my future. And I wanted to bring up a theme that I think is really relevant to this panel, and I would love to hear your thoughts on, but also to tie together some themes of the conference. What you said, Maria, about modeling livable lives for people who are working in the humanities. And since I've been here as a Rhodes Scholar, I have not been able to see that for myself at all. And as someone who's had the privilege of having something like a Rhodes Scholarship to set me even that bit ahead to be somewhere like Oxford, that shouldn't be the case. And I think my question is, I see, and this is posed to the whole Rhodes community as well, is that we've been tasked with this mission, and I think humanities academics makes it central because it's easy to express why we matter when we talk about the difference that we're going to make in the world, the changes that we can bring to other disciplines, the concrete impacts that we can have on society. And that's fantastic, and that's sort of the Rhodes mission, which seems to go hand in hand with a really scary reduction of the humanities to its use value in other ways. And that's something that I felt like has gone on a little bit during this forum, and I think maybe we can question it more in the sense that when I wrote my Rhodes statement to get here, I said I have this particular idea, I want to write it, and that I want to use that writing to change the way people think about this issue. You know, I connected it to law, but I don't think necessarily that it's my role in this world to be a lawyer, to put that into practice. I want to write the thing. I want to teach students. I want to do humanities on the ground in ways that are not immediately connected to something that somebody is saying as useful. And in the precariousness of this discipline financially, which I think you can also speak to, as somebody who is going back, you know, like I don't necessarily, I've been lucky enough to get this scholarship, but I don't know what funding I'm going to have for a PhD, if any, especially in a discipline like transgender studies. And I guess my question is like, is there any space in the future of the humanities that is not connected to this use value? And I think if anyone was in Maureen McLean's poetry session, and connected to this idea of wasting time as a productive thing, and being useless in some way, like, is there still some room for that here? That is in a future that includes the neoliberal university and these structures.
Okay. Maria, do you want to start that?
No, I think these are really, really great and super important questions. And, you know, I think that when I talk about experiments in humanities for a public audience, I'll often talk about all of the activity that we're doing out there, the important things on the ground, and everyone's like, oh, yes, that's great. We should fund her some more. And I'm like, yes, you write that down. But, you know, I think it's really important that when I say spaces for experimentation, I think that also has to mean spaces for failure, spaces for, you know, messing about. You know, for example, last semester we had a course on poetry, which was a 7-hour course in which you hand in all of your technology and you spend 7 hours lying on the floor reading poetry, taking walks, and talking about it, which to us is also a form of experimentalism in this day and age. So, you know, I think that first, that's incredibly important that we recognize that even as we advocate for ourselves out there in the world, that we have this capacity to code switch and talk to those powers that be, that we hold at the core of ourselves what is important to us. And this is part of the livable life thing for me. You know, someone who I really respect, who used to be actually at the Mellon Foundation, said that the humanities is a study of not just what keeps us alive, but what makes life worth living. And to me, that is so incredibly important. I had to, as a Rhodes Scholar, face this question. In fact, my interview was like this really slightly offensive, but actually very effective, a barrage of like, how is what you're gonna study, fight the world's fight, over and over and over, until I actually lost my temper and shouted at them. Anyway, worked out. But that feeling, right, of, you know, I believe that creating space in the world for the pursuit of beauty, for thinking about what it means to be human is fundamentally essential. And what has lasted over the centuries, over the years, the things that we pass down, sure, many of these texts, there are problems with them, but what lies at the heart of many of them is this contemplation, this wrestling with the human experience, with beauty, what is this world? And, you know, so even as we are making our arguments for use value, I think we can never deceive ourselves that we think, you know, how important it is just to be in the world and the things that we do. So I believe there's a future for what you are doing and what many of you are doing, and there has to be. Otherwise, what's the point?
Shall I take a further question at the front and invite the other panelists to come in?
We've been told how humanities has been reduced to 14%, or some space. Within that, I would want to say that the faith communities have been practically wiped off the table and maybe seem to be ready for putting in a museum and preserve it. But you know, because underneath the kind of spiritual poetry that Rebecca was quoting are the sacred texts of, you know, the major faith traditions in the world, and these can function as touchstones, lighthouses for the big questions we've been precisely talking about. But a recent book by Karen Armstrong talks about the kind of lack of literacy in in the spiritual writings across the board. And then we wonder why we're all feeling a bit lost and lonely. Now, I'm the first to admit that the faith traditions themselves have got all sorts of problems, which make them difficult to be accessible to the world. But that's a problem that we need to deal with from within traditions. And I mean, it's not just the Christian tradition is certainly guilty on that front, but I think the other traditions have their problems, particularly in this area where the politicians are only too happy to kind of coerce or co-opt religions. And we heard about that in India, and of course the Christians have done it too. So, what's the feeling about the faith traditions and their place and their role in this all?
I've had a sign saying that's the last question, but I'm really glad you asked that question, because it does seem to me that questions of belief in humanities have not been very much to the fore these last couple of days, and so I think it would be very good as a closing reflection to think a little bit about that. And after all, that is where much humanities study began, certainly here, but in many other places in the world as well.
Certainly in my part of the world, it's very much a part of life, the various faiths. I mean, West Indians or Anglophone Caribbean people are very spiritual, not just in a organized religion, but also in terms of alternative spiritual practices or codes of thought. And that is something that I engage in quite openly with the students, because I'm not interested in doctrine. That is not what belongs in the classroom. But the work that comes out of what's been inspired by that belief system is very important. And I just want to mention to Levi, one of the things that will stay with me for the rest of my life, and there's very little that this job has offered that will stay with me for the rest of my life, is the student who say to you afterwards, my children read because of you, or something you changed the way I think, or something like that. It's the best thing in this world about this job. When you see somebody's eyes opening, when they grasp some, as you said, some of these deep truths about being, about life, about love, about grief, whatever it is, through a work of art. And they will never think in the same biased way again about oppressing others or judging people based on their gender or their sexual choice, because they have had their minds opened, and if I've been a small part of it, then this job is well worth doing, and whoever sees it as invaluable or valuable, that is beside the point. The students do, and that's what matters. Sorry, I got off your point, but that's my spiritual belief.
Rebecca?
One of them.
And I think one of the things that's so powerful here is I think there is that ability to draw on people's lived experiences and contexts, some of which may be very rich in knowledge or experience of a particular religious tradition, which might include things like music and art and food and family life. Again, that sense of lived religion, not just theology, although theology may also be important, in the theological, philosophical realm. But sometimes, bringing together that which people may have experience of with what are the things you might need to know to access a particular text to understand T.S. Eliot, or to, my husband teaches 10th and 12th grade English. He's teaching the Gospel of Mark to his students, and very few of them, whether Christian or not Christian, what is a gospel? What does this mean? What is the text, and how does this get drawn on by literary tradition? In the US, there may be a certain squirreliness about some of these things because people are afraid to walk that line between studying about religion or about a religious text without endorsing it. And there have been some interesting programs that the NEH has funded that are about, here's how you teach about world religions, about religious texts in ways that are sensitive and culturally helpful, and don't people to avoiding it entirely because of a fear of division of church and state. This is one of the great areas for the humanities. It's one of the things for being human. At the same time, I think one of the things in these poems that I'm appealing to from people all across the religious spectrum, our ability to re-understand some of that language and what this person may mean in his or her belief system, how it connects to my sense of what is important in the world, what is divine, whether literally connected to a spiritual practice, or a sense in that sense of the sacredness of the human, the sacredness of what we do in the humanities, which for some people is either coming from or is tied to, oh, well, it says, we are made in the divine image, so that means a certain thing to me, or in other places, the sacredness of our individual identity, of the things that we could do or mean, that sense of the desire for human flourishing, not just professional success or filling out, jumping into the whatever category people want you to be in. And so being able to make those levels of translation and connect those to those things that are to us sacred and worth preserving.
Thank you. Maria. Sure, yeah. And I will just add to this, in my other intellectual life, I have a book that's about to come out, which is about children's fantasy literature. And the title of the book is Re-Enchanted. And the reason is because so much of 20th century and 21st century fantasy is obsessed with this notion of how do we find enchantment in the world. So even in a moment where I think in the West, many people feel like there's great secularism and a great turnback of interest in religion, I don't think there's any abatement of interest in these profound questions, this desire for enchantment, this search for magic. And a lot of what I look at also is the ways in which childhood itself comes to be seen as a site of magic and enchantment in the world. A secular form for some people. So and over and over again, I see the ways in which my students engage with questions of childhood, of magic, of enchantment, often including, literatures that have long been excluded from the humanities in a traditional sense, seen as not important or not worthy, but really are in some cases the foundational texts of many people's lives. So I do think we have other ways also of thinking about what is sacred to people and how to use those texts as a way to get at these bigger questions. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. Well, join me in thanking our three fantastic panelists.